Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the scaling panel. I'm Sriram Kannan. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I am
moderator on the end.
sit like this so I can see you all. I'm Sriram Kannan. I'm a faculty member at the University of Washington, Seattle, where I run the UW Blockchain Research Lab, working on consensus, scalability, all of this stuff. Also founder of a project called EigenLayer. I'll let the other panelists introduce themselves. Nick, maybe you can.
Nick, I'm COO of Celestia Labs, and we're building the first modular blockchain network. So we take a radically different approach to building blockchains, where you separate what a standard monolithic protocol is into two separate or multiple separate layers, and you get lots of benefits. You get better scalability, you get secure interoperability, and you get more flexibility around the execution environment. So it's next generation infrastructure that I think will enable people to build applications in a less limited way.
John?
Hey everyone, I'm John Charbonneau. I'm a researcher over at Delphi Digital, primarily focused on infrastructure broadly, so layer 1s, layer 2s, MEV, all that kind of stuff.
Sunny?
Hey guys, my name is Sunny. You probably just heard me talk, but in case you're new to the room, I work on a project called Osmosis. It's a DEX built on its own blockchain, and it's part of what we call the more broadly Cosmos ecosystem. And I'm working in this Cosmos ecosystem for about 5 years or so.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. The theme of the panel, we should keep our mic closer, otherwise the theme of the panel is scalability. So we'll start with a question. What does scalability mean? Particularly, can you put a mathematical formula for what scalability is?
I can start. I think a lot of people think that scalability is just the raw transactions per second that a blockchain can process. But the problem with that is that it ignores the core value proposition of blockchains, which is verifiability. So the whole point of Web3 is that people can verify that the rules that everyone has agreed to have been followed. So in order to enforce the rules, people need to be able to verify themselves. So my definition of scalability is the throughput, but divided by the cost to verify that throughput. So like, for example, Solana would not necessarily be increasing scalability because although the TPS is larger than, let's say, Ethereum, the cost is also greater. So that the denominator is also scaled with the numerator, so you don't really get scaling.
John?
Yeah, so broadly, I would generally define it the same way of if you just naively say increase the block size, that's not actually scaling because you just literally essentially increase the cost to also do that. I will say that Solana does do some things which I do definitely consider scaling, to be fair to them. They do some very good things on the execution environment, like parallel execution, I think is very important, and we'll see more of that. So there is more that you can do on the execution environment itself, but fundamentally, keeping in mind the really, really easy, very simple full verifiability from users is important.
Sunny?
Parallel execution isn't live on Solana.
Is it what?
Parallel execution isn't live on Solana. It's a meme. It doesn't actually exist right now.
Wow, that's actually news to me.
Yeah. They don't, not even signature verification is parallel. Everything is sequential right now. Anyway, sorry. So yeah, this idea of everyone, as we increase the number of things that people, the total transactions in the system, you have to run, you have to process all the transactions. And I think that's where the fundamental mistake is, that not everyone cares about all transactions, right? When you're running an Ethereum node today, you might be a Uniswap user, but you don't care about random NFTs that are being traded, or you don't care about some other random game that's built on the system. But by the nature of its like generalized single-threaded, like a single-pipe system, and you're being forced to verify the entire thing, that's like where the lack of scalability comes from. So the trick to getting actual scalability is like shard things in application space so people can choose to verify and run nodes for the applications that they care about, and then have well-defined interfaces for how applications compose and interact with each other.
Awesome. I'll add my own definition for scalability. One way to think about scalability is to look at the system throughput and then divide it by the node throughput. What node requirements are you placing? For example, just think of a place where you write data. You can say, what is the rate at which you can write data to Ethereum? And then that is in some bytes per second. And then the denominator is how much node requirement am I placing? Each node, which is a consensus node in the system, has to have like, a 10 megabytes per second connection or 1 megabyte per second connection or whatever. And then the ratio of those two is the scaling. I think what Nick defined is external or verifiability scaling. Somebody does something and then from outside, how much can I verify that that was done correctly? That's an important dimension of scaling. There's also an internal dimension of scaling, which is nodes participating in the system. Also, what is the node requirement, and the numerator is what is the system throughput. Okay, so the various definitions of scalability at play here also lead to very different system choices for what type of systems are being built. We see at least 3 different thrusts for in ways in which people are building these scalable systems. Number one is these high-performance parallel execution chains. Solana. Now we have Sui and Aptos, and Algorand wants to now be parallel and so on. So we have many chains trying to essentially scale by having higher performance. And then there is interchain scalability, which is you have some kind of way in which you can share security across different chains. And then there is the modular data availability based scaling. Can maybe, each of you describe one of these methods? Maybe we can start with Nick on the modular scaling.
Sure, yeah. I kind of want to go last because I think of modular as sort of like being able to tie all the different threads together.
Yeah, sure. Let's
maybe.
get John to take the role of high performance chains.
Sure. So I'll take the maybe soon to be parallel execution Solana and then Sui and Aptos. But basic idea, I would say, of like their general pitch is it's really important to have everything on one chain because one of the most important things about all the DeFi that we love is composability. So breaking things up across many chains, supposedly hurts composability. It does to some degree, whether it depends on the case, depends on what use case you need. But the basic idea is we want to keep everything on one chain because there's a lot of benefits to that. So, okay, how do we get a lot of TPS to go through this thing? And there's stuff that you can do with the execution environment to take advantage of the fact that computers don't have to run everything sequentially. You can have parallel execution so that you're taking better advantage of the hardware. So that does help you scale. Generally, there is some essential limit to that where, like, realistically, the hardware requirements of being a node on Solana or Sui or one of those is probably going to be higher than people in Bitcoin and Ethereum are comfortable with. So that is a trade-off of what is decentralization, what is the metric that we're optimizing for. But that is the general path.
Yeah. This whole thing about like composability only works on a single chain is like, all of web development is built off of like asynchronous composability, and the web still has composability today, and like the entire internet can't run on one server, the entire interchain can't run on one, like all of finance can't run on one blockchain. It's just like literally not going to be possible. And the only way to build these systems is to build like asynchronous composability with like really good UX. And the goal is to make it so that the UX of asynchronous composability should feel as good as synchronous composability. We've kind of done that in web development over the last 20 years. JavaScript callback hell used to suck, but nowadays it's actually pretty nice. You have async await, you have promises, you have all these like syntactic sugar that actually makes this whole system work really well, and that's like the direction that I think blockchain development is going to go as well. And I guess like in Cosmos, in this interchain system that we're building, we're just sort of the farthest along on building the tooling to make that possible. Like, everyone else is like thinking about cross-chain token transfers right now. In Cosmos, we are like very much focused on like cross-chain composability. Using the Cosmos, we have this thing called interchain accounts. You can have an account on one chain, make transactions on another chain. So a DAO or a multi-sig on one chain can make actions on another chain. Or the smart contracting system built into the Cosmos SDK is called Cosmwasm. It's an actor-based message passing system, which makes it like you can take a contract that you write and like with very slight modifications, it's as easy to call a contract on another chain as it is to call a contract on the same chain. And so, the idea of the interchain scaling system is basically what I said earlier about this idea of like, shard everything in application space and let people run the chains that they can, run the state machines for the applications that they care about.
So I'll first broadly explain modular blockchains and then I'll kind of touch on those two. As I said, what we believe scalability to mean is an increase in throughput while without increasing the cost to verify. And so there's two, I think, fundamental technological breakthroughs that came about in 2019 that changed the game in terms of scalability. The first is rollups. So this concept of rollups is a way in which you can execute transactions in a way that other people don't have to re-execute them to verify that it's correct. So that's huge because it collapses the cost of verifying blockchains, at least like the validity of transactions and state transitions. So that's a huge one. And then the next big one was that rollups for their security required this thing called data availability. Typically that meant you have to download an entire block. So as the block size gets bigger, you have to download more and more data, which obviously would increase the cost in terms of bandwidth and whatever else. But there's a solution to that called data availability sampling, which also collapsed the cost of verifying data availability. So even as the block size increases, the cost to verify it increases, but only sublinearly. And so those two things are the fundamental innovations that power modular blockchains and make it so that even as you add more and more throughput, more and more chains, more transactions, the cost to verify does not increase as much. So that's the huge part. But both are very valid, and it's kind of like all part of the modular thesis. So we have there's a project called Fuel, building a rollup that is all about parallelized transactions. And so they get all these advantages of like maximizing the hardware of the nodes. And we also believe that we shouldn't scale all of crypto on one single rollup either, or any one chain. It should be parallel. So we're also very much part of like the Cosmos vision of application-specific chains for all the reasons that Sunny gave as well.
Awesome. So now to the spicy part. So can you point out one issue with the other scaling marks? Okay, so I'm going to ask Sunny to go first.
So I guess I already pointed out the issue with the single chain system, so I'll do the data availability. Or with rollups, I think there's been this like big push around, like people, at least the current generation seem to be very much focused on single node operator rollups. And I think this is like really harmful to the space as a whole, because single operator rollups, yes, the rollup system gives you safety guarantees because of these like proofs and everything, but you still need a decentralized consensus protocol for the rollup, because the rollup system doesn't give you liveness or censorship MEV resistance guarantees. And so if you want to actually have like censorship and MEV resistance, and you want to have like, I call it fast liveness. Like, yes, I know in rollups you can like exit to main chain, but that's like very slow liveness. If you want fast liveness and strong censorship resistance, you need to have a decentralized validator set that's operating the rollup. And then in that case, I'd argue we already have pretty good data availability systems. It's called consensus protocols. You have a few hundred validators running your consensus protocol. As long as one of them's honest, great. You have pretty decent data availability. So I think the data sampling is like useful, but I don't think it's like. I think it's been a little bit overemphasized as how big of an issue it is.
Thank you, Sunny, for getting that started. John, do you want to take a shot at any of the, maybe all three if you want?
I do tend to do that a lot, so that'll be fun. So I guess, am I allowed to rip on the like single mono chain thing? Okay, I'm just gonna do that. That one's pretty easy. Yeah, so like as I said, I don't think that realistically like we're running the world's computer on this like one thing. Fundamentally, I do not think it will scale anywhere nearly as far as we need it to. And I do actually strongly agree with what Sonny was talking about before of not nearly everything is going to need just immediate synchronous composability with absolutely everything else. You don't need your NFTs next to your like decentralized exchange. The things that do need that, great. You can have general purpose execution environments that fill that need, which can have certain DeFi apps that really do need that. The large majority of it can work in very, very good asynchronous composability manners. You're effectively just making very large sacrifices on the decentralization component for just completely unnecessary reasons, in my view, to really not gain much on that composability, giving you much of an advantage.
And sort of add like, you can also get like high levels of synchronous composability without being a full generalized system. Like, one of the things that we're working very closely with this project called Mars that actually spins out of is like part of Delphi, but like is building like, for a leverage trading system, you need high levels of synchronous composability between the lending protocol and the DEX, right? And so that's what we're working with Mars on building without necessarily needing to build a fully like, revert to using a generalized system.
So I'll criticize, not criticize is too strong a word, but critique the sort of just the Cosmos, I guess, scaling vision as it stands today, without like a shared data availability layer. So, because Celestia, to clarify, is very much a part of the Cosmos community, and we want to, like, we're bullish Cosmos and we support Cosmos. However, we think that a shared security layer like Celestia is necessary to get to the end game of Cosmos. So the problem with Cosmos as it is today is that it's fine when the number of chains is relatively small and all the chains are relatively secure and they're all kind of like known quantities, which is the state of the Cosmos ecosystem today. However, if we want to move to a world where Web3 is operating at the scale of Web2, and there might be even hundreds of thousands of chains or app chains, or maybe even more. I don't know. That's far, far in the future, but I think it's where we do want to go. The issue with Cosmos interoperability and security at that sort of level is that each time you make a IBC connection with another chain, there is counterparty risk. You are basically having to trust that the other validator set will not be malicious, because if they do become malicious, they can steal bridged assets essentially. So how does data availability solve that? Is that, well, it's the combination of data availability and rollups. So rollups have something called sort of like secure light clients. So they actually, rather than just trusting the majority of people to know about what another blockchain is doing, they actually directly verify the state transitions using fraud or validity proofs. And so that means that you're not trusting the other chain to be honest. They can't cheat you because it's just not possible. So long as you're sharing a common data availability layer. So I think in the long term, I think Cosmos needs to move in a direction like that in order for the interoperability model to work.
Awesome, thank you. As a moderator, I'm supposed to remain neutral, so I critique all three. So it seems like all of these visions of scaling have some tension against censorship resistance. So if you take the high-powered node model, okay, I'm running a lot of high-powered nodes, and only people running high-powered nodes can participate in the system. How decentralized can it be? So you have an issue with censorship resistance. In the interchain security model, the same set of validators are securing a lot of different chains. So that's effectively high performance requirement. And to the extent that interchain security actually is shared security, right?
I think that the mesh security system avoids that issue.
But it also gives you less interchain security. So there's a natural trade-off there. So you have this idea that if you have like fully shared security through interchain security, which is part of the point of interchain security, you have this issue of censorship resistance. The same thing even with the data availability network. While data availability is easily perceived or verified, transaction inclusion is what determines censorship resistance, and light nodes play no role in this. So it seems all three visions have a fundamental tension against censorship resistance. Any counterpoints?
So one of the things that like how Osmosis actually started was before we started building DEX, before we started building a DEX, we started building this system for threshold decryption, which is basically a way of making sure mempools are fully private, and you make it so that like validators and proposers can't actually read the content of transactions before they get committed and finalized to a block. And I think, there are issues, there are concerns, but I think that actually like threshold decryption style systems will help solve like most censorship and MEV issues.
Okay, I'm not going to push on the MEV point, spam and stuff like that, but other points?
Yeah, I would say at least from the Rollup perspective, I think if you are reliant on like the Rollup operators themselves for censorship resistance, then I wouldn't really consider it a Rollup. Like you have to have some degree of forced transaction inclusion and exit, such that you're ultimately reliant on the base layer.
But the base layer itself,
Yes, the base layer itself, you do have some reliance on there. And that's why it's very important to keep that, the very decentralized censorship resistance part, and then everyone can share in that security.
Any other comments? Okay, if not, we can go to the next. One of the things that came up again and again is this sequencer in a rollup. So a sequencer in a rollup aggregates transactions and then makes a commitment. One thing that came up many times in the panel is the idea that the sequencer, I think Sunny raised this, the sequencer itself needs to be decentralized. How do you all think about the limits of decentralized sequencers? And for example, Sunny pointed out that in one issue with having a sequencer be decentralized is it then becomes the same as a chain. And so what is, let's say, the modular blockchain vision on how to decentralize the sequencer?
It's not something that I think there's only one solution for, or that needs to be imposed. I think there's going to be like a lot of different approaches. I do think Sunny has a point that as you increase the number of sequencers, then it looks more and more like a normal blockchain. However, there's a lot less overhead because you're not having to actually run consensus. It's really just leader selection, or just having the ability for multiple entities to have the right to post a block, essentially. Or you can even have it where anyone can post a block, but then you have to have the right fork choice for it. So there's a huge design space, and so it's hard to really answer that question. What I will say is that in Optimum, which is the sort of sequencer software that we're building, there will be leader selection, sort of like Tendermint stake-weighted leader selection for that purpose. But it's a really good question, and I think there's a lot of work. And rollups in general are still quite early, right? So being realistic about the maturity of the technology is something that's important. But I do believe we'll get there.
So I think that it's useful to still have a consensus protocol over just leader election if you want to do threshold decryption for the rollup. Because doing the threshold, you still want to come to consensus on the list of encrypted transactions, and then the consensus protocol actually just gives you a really nice way of like atomic broadcast of decryption shares anyway. So it is really not that much overhead from building a threshold decryption system towards going towards a full consensus protocol.
Yeah, I definitely see it as an implementation detail. Like it is. I also would say that there are no live rollups other than Fuel V1 today, which is a separate part.
No, it's a good part of the panels on scalability, so please
Check out
refer that.
L2beat.com. You can see
Yes.
what the actual state of rollups is.
Yeah, I
John, go on.
Yeah, I was tweeting about this a lot the other day. Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is that, like, I would say rollups and Cosmos, I think, are taking two similar paths at an endgame, and I think that Cosmos took a more pragmatic view in the beginning, to be honest, of, hey, let's build a reasonably decentralized chain that, like, actually works really well. Ethereum has, I really like the rollup endgame. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that the reality is rollup teams have made some very serious sacrifices in the short term to get like a product live and to be competitive. The reality is for a lot of these, like they are fully centralized sequencers, which you can do, but that's a little bit more concerning when like they don't necessarily have any proofs live. So if it's one person running it and there's no proofs, yeah. Or if they have proofs, but it's whitelisted to like only the person who's running the role can post those proofs, like I don't know if that's that much better. The reality is like they're very early stages, like I think that is like a meaningful trade-off. I think that you will see a very broad design space of like, I think that a lot of rollups, you do not necessarily need a consensus protocol. You do need it if you want things like thresholds, like you know, like Shuttered is looking at doing threshold for rollups. Whether or not you want to do that. Like you can also get like a stronger degree of pre-confirmations in between confirming to the actual L1, like start working at the validator set, that you know, hey, between posting our ZK proofs, like we can give you a stronger pre-confirmation in the interim because you now have the economic security of our validator set in between that. So it's a design space. It's a trade-off because yeah, if you run everything on a centralized sequencer, it's really easy to do what they do today, which is we don't really have to worry about MEV, like quote unquote. I mean, they still do, it's still an issue, but it's easier to do fair ordering if you're running it yourself. It's easier to get really low latency if you're just running it yourself. There's a lot of complexities as you try to decentralize it, and you're seeing every role taking a different path, and that's probably the thing that I'm most excited about watching all these rollups is some will do thresholds, some will do an MEV auction, some will have centralized sequencers, like some will have a consensus, and we're gonna get to see these things live and in the wild the next couple of years, and we'll get to see what actually works, which will be a lot of fun.
Can I give a critique of the Cosmos vision?
Yeah.
The benefit of rollups is, I think the mesh security design of that I talked about just now, it says it has very high punishment for when things go wrong, and you know, it makes sure a lot of people get sloshed. It doesn't provide a recovery path. It's like, well, now what do you do? And you know, it kind of relies on social consensus to figure out how to recover the system. Rollups actually have like a built-in, you know, here's how the system automatically recovers. So that is one benefit of the rollup architecture. Obviously, the problem is rollup architecture comes with like much higher latency and it's more expensive because all the data has to be like, available to the main chain and all this other stuff.
I would critique it being more expensive. I think a significant benefit of rollups over using interchain security is that it is far cheaper. Because the cost of posting data is very minimal compared to paying your inflation to another chain, like inflating your token. Say, you know, you're paying 25% of your inflation, your fees, to like the chain whose security. Like that's what it looks like the split is for. If I'm say a consumer chain that's using the Cosmos hub for security.
Well, that version of interchain security is like $10 in my opinion.
Okay, that's fair. So the V1 of it is okay. Yeah, that's fair. And the later.
I don't treat that as like the real vision of Cosmos shared security.
That's fair. Yeah.
When you said rollups have a built-in sort of mechanism for recovery, what did you mean by that? Like exit or like?
Yeah, this exit system where in the rollup world, like the final main chain, let's say it's Ethereum, is the final source of truth, right? The Cosmos mesh security vision, there is no one final settlement layer, right? Like The idea is every chain is the settlement layer for its own native tokens and its own natively issued state, right? And so because there's no one final settlement layer, that, I think the Ethereum model, when things go wrong, it's easier to we have to decide what happens on the settlement layer and then we move forward. While in the Cosmos thing, we have to have this giant multi-party decision-making process of okay, things went wrong. How do we all agree on how to recover the system?
But maybe that's also a superpower because it gives more sovereignty to the individual chains and communities rather than having one super. It's sort of I think of the Cosmos vision as sort of nations that are equals, whereas the Ethereum rollup vision is there's one nation, which is Ethereum, and then rollups are sort of incorporations, or maybe states in a federation or something. But they all report back to this, monolithic, larger community that, I don't know, may not have their best interests in mind.
Agreed.
Latent in that discussion, which is this broader point, which is in general in blockchains, not specific to scaling, but in general in blockchains, there is this fundamental trade-off between subjectivity, or you can call it sovereignty, and objectivity or credible neutrality. And these two kind of tug and pull on each other in complex ways. For example, you want to be resistant to bugs, right? Like smart contract bugs or hacks or whatever. If you had some subjective way to recover from it, it could be helpful. But on the other hand, what is your subjective decision creates externalities and ripples through the rest of the system. Your sovereignty is at the cost of composability. And I think particularly in the context of scalability, the way I would reflect this is when you want low latency composability, any subjectivity or sovereignty interferes with some other node, which has some other system which has consumed your state and now is at risk. So I don't think there's an answer to this, but any thoughts on this trade-off is appreciated, because I think this is at the heart of blockchains. And when I was asked what is the one bad case for blockchains, if we can't figure this out, that's the bad case for blockchains.
Yeah, that's kind of why. That's kind of what I meant by it's higher latency on the rollup version. When I got into the space, when Bitcoin were oh, we make fun of the banks for oh, they take 3 days to process transactions, and I was we have these 3-day waiting periods on rollups. It's yeah, we're kind of finally learning why those things existed, because you need time for subjective decision making before you broadcast decisions to other consumers of your decisions.
Nick or Joe, any thoughts?
You're good.
Well, I think this is a really important question. I don't know if there's an answer. It all is up to what people believe. And I think where I stand or where I fall on this question is that, blockchains at their core are just social coordination tools, and they're meant to encode and enforce agreements between groups of people, but in a digital sort of internet native way. And the reason that's important is that at the end of the day, the blockchains only have value because people believe they have value and place their value in it. And so at the end of the day, forking or exiting the system is always an option. So the notion that code is law is, I think, a misnomer, because it's really the social voting of people that is law at the end of the day on blockchains. So I just think that's fundamental. I don't see how you get around that. If the universal settlement layer that is the arbiter of all disputes, and no one can disagree with it, people can disagree with it, just choose not to use it and fork away.
There's notion of high latency to allow for subjective decision making. I love every time you come up with good models of how to think about things.
I agree.
But so we kind of actually, so we're actually doing this in the next Osmosis upgrade, where in IBC we added a rate limiting system where it says that hey, a maximum of 20% of this channel's volume can leave every 6 hours. So that way, if there's ever a hack or something, it gives time for subjective decision making. We can cap the losses. Okay, 20% left, but like we can save 80% of the losses through like subjective decision making to halt the chain or something like that. So there's actually sort of an example of like that kind of ideas are coming into Cosmos as well.
Yeah, I think Cosmos can be one of the most powerful experimentation hubs where small groups can already start experimenting with many of these ideas. And once they're successful, they can proliferate in many ways. We should take at least one audience question. Yes, please.
I am missing something like the relationship between collaterals and finality. There should be a way
Between?
Collaterals. For example, when you are building a bridge in Cosmos, right, you have to stake over there. And there should be a way of scaling by creating a balance between finality and collateral.
Like more economic finality. Yeah, like, there's a trade-off space between like, I would say like between risk and finality, I would call it. So like something we're working on with Axelar is like allowing this like risk finality trade-off curve to be built into the bridge system where so Axelar, it takes a while to bridge things from Ethereum because actually, weirdly enough, somehow it takes longer post-merge than it did pre-merge. I don't know why, but yeah. So like you have to make a lot of blocks because the bridge system itself needs maximum security to like allow the bridge to happen. But you can allow like individual participants to like take on the risk from the bridge and front money that's being bridged over. So like, let's say you're transferring ETH over from Ethereum to Osmosis, you would have to wait 50 blocks of Ethereum. But maybe there's a market maker or something sitting in the middle who sees that it's like 5 blocks deep on Ethereum, and they're saying like, hey, I'm okay with that level of risk. I think that's finalized enough. So I'm gonna front the money here, give you the ETH on Osmosis, and then when your ETH actually does arrive, it'll come to me rather than to you. And so they can take a small like fee for doing that, right? And so there's basically this trade-off curve being like created of like, hey, what risk are you willing to accept in order to get faster finance, like faster execution?
And that should be the foundation why this application-based chain that in the next security have a better future than the huge liquidity pool like Ethereum. That is what
I think that's like part of how we make the UX of the multi-chain world useful.
The same model is also applicable to rollups on something like Ethereum, instant liquidity providers. And essentially what you're doing is you're transferring a trust problem into a computational problem. If you have the computational resources to calculate that the rollup will settle correctly, you can actually front the money and do instant liquidity. So much of these things, this difference between Cosmos and Ethereum, we're seeing massive convergent evolution. Like a lot of the ideas are replicated. To just quote one that I'm working on, EigenLayer is a mechanism for interchain security for Ethereum. So that's another example of convergent evolution. Any final thoughts before we conclude? Maybe 30 seconds each on scalability.
Sure. So, yeah, my high level is I think that basically the Ethereum, Cosmos, Celestia, I think that everyone honestly has a pretty similar game. I think that those are the general vision of what is going to converge, and that is going to be the way that you actually are able to scale this thing effectively, to billions of people.
So what about Sui and Solana?
Yeah, sorry. Don't throw out too many pins here.
Others?
No, I think really excited for all of these things to start playing out. I think rollups and sovereign chains will be converging. Having common shared data and knowledge between them is really helpful. So things like Celestia will help with a lot of data stuff. Shriram's, EigenLayer is cool, but the project that Shriram was involved with that's actually cooler is called Babylon. It's a way of checkpointing proof of stake blockchains into Bitcoin proof of work and using that as a common knowledge shared security layer, and that will allow way faster finality systems. So that's really cool as well. Yeah.
Is Babylon coming to Cosmos in any way?
Yeah, they're building a Cosmos SDK chain and helping other Cosmos SDK chains checkpoint into proof of work.
Oh, I did not even know that. Okay, cool. Yeah, my I guess 30-second summary would be that I think modular blockchains are the end game. I don't think they dominate everything. I think there's going to be like a very heterogeneous thing. There's going to be lots of just normal Cosmos type zones like standalone chains, and it's going to be a path to get there. Right? We're not going to get there overnight. It's going to take a long time and a lot of building. And so I hope that all of you contribute in some way. And so if you're interested to learn more, I'd love to talk to you guys because you guys are like the next generation.
Awesome. My concluding 30 seconds is, if you look at Ethereum today and the modular ecosystem around it, there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on, but there are still like massive problems. How do we get high data throughput? How do we get decentralized sequences? How do we get high security bridges like the one IBC has built? And if you're interested in any of these ideas, stop by at my talk at 4 o'clock today. I'm going to be presenting a vision for how Ethereum can actually upgrade itself in all these dimensions. Thanks to all